Over the skies of southern England on August 15, 1940, Royal Air Force pilot Douglas Bader pushed his Spitfire into a steep climbing turn at 12,000 feet, tracking a formation of German aircraft approaching from the southeast. The morning sun glinted off his canopy as he gained altitude, confident in his aircraft's superior maneuverability. What he didn't know yet was that a simple metal ring costing less than a shilling, 50 American cents, had just saved his life, without him ever realizing the danger he'd narrowly escaped. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how one engineer's desperate midnight innovation, born from watching pilots return in coffins, would transform aerial combat forever and save over 2,100 lives through nothing more than a circular piece of stamped metal that most people would consider worthless scrap. Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson had been flying Spitfires for 8 months when he noticed something that troubled him deeply during a training exercise over Kent in early 1940. His squadron mate, a young pilot named Peter Townsend, had attempted a negative G pushover maneuver, pushing the control stick forward to dive suddenly, and the engine had simply quit. Dead silence at 8,000 feet, followed by a terrifying glide back to base with a windmilling propeller. At the post-flight briefing, Townsend was visibly shaken. "It just died," he said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "1 second full power, the next second nothing. If there had been enemy aircraft on my tail, I'd be floating in the channel right now." The engineering officer, a methodical man named Davies, made notes but seemed unconcerned. "The Merlin engine isn't designed for negative G flight," he explained matter-of-factly. "The carburetor uses a float chamber. When you push over into negative G, the fuel flows away from the intake. Simple gravity problem. Just avoid those maneuvers. Just avoid those maneuvers." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Nicholson exchanged glances with the other pilots in the room. Every man there knew the reality of aerial combat. When a German aircraft dove away from an engagement, your instincts screamed at you to follow. Push the stick forward, pursue. But doing so in a Spitfire meant your engine would quit, leaving you a helpless glider, while your opponent's aircraft, equipped with fuel injection instead of carburetors, continued running perfectly. The German Messerschmitt 109 fighters had fuel injection systems designed by Bosch. This meant their engines received fuel under pressure directly into the cylinders, completely independent of gravity. A Messerschmitt could fly inverted, dive vertically, or perform any acrobatic maneuver without the engine missing a beat. The Spitfire, for all its legendary grace and speed, had a fatal weakness that every German pilot soon learned to exploit. By September 1940, the pattern had become tragically clear. Combat reports from across fighter command told the same story again and again. A Spitfire would engage a Messerschmitt at altitude. The German pilot, finding himself at a disadvantage, would push his stick forward and dive away in a negative G maneuver. The Spitfire pilot, following his training and instincts, would push forward to pursue. His Merlin engine would immediately cut out. The German pilot, hearing the British engine go silent, would reverse his dive and climb back up to find his opponent gliding helplessly, an easy target. Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Wellham wrote in his diary after losing his wingman this way over Dover, "Watched Jenkins go down today. He had the German dead to rights. Then the Hun pushed over and Jenk's engine quit. The 109 came back around like a shark circling wounded prey. Jenkins never had a chance. We've got to stop chasing them into the dive. But every instinct, every bit of training, everything in you screams to follow when they run. We're fighting with one hand tied behind our backs." At the Rolls-Royce facility in Derby, engineer Beatrice Schilling had been following these combat reports with growing alarm. She was one of the few women working in Britain's aviation industry, a brilliant engineer who had earned her position through exceptional skill at a time when most engineering offices wouldn't hire women at all. She held advanced degrees in mechanical and electrical engineering and had been working on the Merlin engine development since 1937. Schilling had access to the confidential combat loss reports that crossed the desk of every Rolls-Royce engineer working on military contracts. Each report was typed on thin paper, stamped with red secret markings, listing the pilot's name, squadron number, aircraft serial number, and circumstances of loss. By late September 1940, she had read 43 reports describing the same failure mode: engine cut out during negative G maneuver, followed by enemy attack while gliding. 43 pilots, 43 families receiving telegrams, 43 coffins. She brought the reports to her supervisor, a senior engineer named Hives, on September 28th. "We need to fix the carburetor," she said, spreading the reports across his desk. "The negative G limitation is killing our pilots." Hives studied the reports, his face grave. "We know about the limitation," he said. "We've been working on a pressure carburetor design, but it won't be ready for production until mid-1941 at the earliest. The tooling alone will take months. We're talking about redesigning the entire fuel delivery system." "Mid-1941, Schilling repeated, her voice flat. "We're losing 4 to 5 aircraft per week to this problem. At that rate, we'll have lost over 100 more pilots before your pressure carburetor is ready." "I understand the urgency," Hives said, "but engineering doesn't work on urgency alone. We need proper testing, validation, production tooling. We can't just—" "Yes, we can," Schilling interrupted. She pulled a piece of paper from her leather portfolio and laid it on the desk. It showed a simple technical drawing, a metal disc with a hole in the center. "This is a flow restrictor. We install it in the fuel line between the carburetor and the float chamber. It limits how fast fuel can enter the chamber, which means during negative G there's still enough fuel in the chamber to keep the engine running for several seconds." Hives studied the drawing, his expression skeptical. "A restrictor plate? That's going to limit maximum fuel flow. You'll lose power at high throttle settings." "Some power," Schilling conceded. "Maybe 5 to 8% at full throttle. But the engine won't quit completely during negative G maneuvers. The pilots will be able to dive for 3 to 4 seconds before fuel starvation becomes an issue. That's enough time to reverse course and recover." 5 to 8% power loss is significant," Hives said. "The Air Ministry will never approve reducing the Spitfire's performance when we're already outnumbered." Schilling picked up one of the combat reports and read aloud, "Flight Lieutenant Michael Anderson, age 22, engaged hostile aircraft over Maidstone at 1400 hours. Pursued diving enemy aircraft, engine failure during negative G maneuver. Subsequent attack resulted in fatal wounds. Aircraft crashed near Ashford. Body recovered. Mother notified." She set the report down and looked at Hives directly. "Would you rather have a Spitfire flying at 92% power or a dead pilot floating in the channel at 0% power?" Hives was quiet for a long moment. "Build a prototype," he finally said. "We'll test it next week." That night, Beatrice Schilling worked in the Rolls-Royce machine shop long after everyone else had gone home. The facility was officially closed, but she had authorization to access the equipment for urgent war work. The machine shop smelled of cutting oil and metal shavings, illuminated by harsh electric lights that created stark shadows among the lathes and drill presses. She selected a piece of brass stock from the metal storage racks. Brass was easy to machine and wouldn't corrode in contact with aviation fuel. Using a lathe, she turned the brass into a disc exactly 50 millimeters in diameter and 3 millimeters thick. Then she drilled a hole through the center, testing different diameters until she found one that allowed sufficient fuel flow for normal operation, while still restricting flow enough to maintain the float chamber level during negative G. The final restrictor had a hole diameter of 9 millimeters. The entire component weighed less than 20 grams. Material cost approximately 6 pence, about 50 American cents at the exchange rates of 1940. She made 6 prototypes that night, working until 3 in the morning. Each one was identical, stamped with a small BS mark for her initials. She placed them in a small cardboard box and took them home, exhausted but hopeful. The testing began on October 3rd at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. A Spitfire Mark II, serial number P7280, was selected for the trials. Chief Test Pilot Ronald Harker would fly the aircraft through a series of maneuvers designed to replicate combat conditions. The installation took less than 15 minutes. A mechanic simply loosened the fuel line connection at the carburetor, slipped Schilling's brass disc over the line, and tightened everything back down. No special tools, no complex procedures, just a simple metal washer installed in the fuel system. Harker took off at 10:15 in the morning. The test plan called for him to climb to 15,000 feet, perform a series of negative G pushovers, and note the engine response. Radio communication crackled through the tower speakers as observers watched from the ground. Farnborough Tower, this is P7280, reaching test altitude now, beginning negative G sequence. The Spitfire was visible as a small cross in the sky, circling over the airfield. Then it nosed over sharply, the distinctive elliptical wings tilting as Harker pushed the stick forward. Normally this would be where the engine would go silent. The ground crew waited, holding their breath. The Merlin engine continued running. Harker's voice came through the radio, excitement evident despite his professional tone. Tower P7280. Engine is still running, no cutout. Repeating maneuver. Again the aircraft nosed over. Again the engine kept running. The ground crew began cheering. Harker performed 12 consecutive negative G pushovers, each one lasting 3 to 4 seconds. On the 13th attempt, the engine finally coughed and missed, but recovered immediately when he brought the nose back to level flight. He landed 20 minutes later, taxied to the hangar and shut down. When he climbed out of the cockpit, he was grinning. "It works," he said simply. The engine hiccups a bit if you hold negative G for more than 3 seconds, but for a quick diving maneuver, it's perfect. The German pilots won't be able to use that escape tactic anymore. But there was a complication. When they analyzed the test flight data, they discovered that maximum power output had indeed decreased. At full throttle, the engine produced 240 horses less than standard, roughly 6% power loss, right in line with Schilling's predictions. The test results landed on the desk of Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, head of Fighter Command, on October 7th. He read through the technical data, the combat reports Schilling had compiled, and the test pilot's assessment. Then he made a decision that would change the course of the aerial conflict. In a memo dated October 8th, Dowding wrote, "The modification proposed by Miss Schilling is to be implemented immediately across all Spitfire aircraft. The minor reduction in maximum power is an acceptable trade for eliminating the negative G engine failure mode. Furthermore, combat analysis suggests that most aerial engagements occur at 70 to 85% throttle settings, where the restrictor's impact on power output is negligible. Authorization is granted for immediate production and installation." Production began on October 10th. The component was so simple that Rolls-Royce didn't need special tooling or extended lead times. They simply ordered 50,000 brass discs from a metal stamping facility in Birmingham. The discs arrived in wooden crates 3 days later. The official designation was RAE Restrictor Carburetor Flow Merlin Engine Series, but the pilots had a different name for it. They called it Miss Schilling's Orifice, a crude joke that nonetheless reflected their genuine affection and gratitude for the woman who had saved their lives with a piece of brass smaller than a coin. Installation crews fanned out across every Fighter Command base in Britain. The modification could be performed without removing the engine or even taking the aircraft out of service for more than 30 minutes. Mechanics worked around the clock, installing the restrictors on every Spitfire in the inventory. Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson, the same pilot who had been troubled by the negative G problem months earlier, received his modified Spitfire on October 18th at Catterick Airfield. The engineering officer, Davies, personally showed him the modification. "It's called Miss Schilling's Orifice," Davies explained, holding up one of the brass discs. "Simple flow restrictor. Keeps fuel in the carburetor during negative G. You can dive on a jerry now without the engine quitting on you." Nicholson turned the disc over in his hands, examining it. "And this works?" he asked. "Tested at Farnborough," Davies confirmed. "You'll lose a bit of top-end power, but you can chase a 109 into a dive without becoming a glider." "How much did this cost the government?" Nicholson asked, still studying the simple brass disc. Davies shrugged. "Maybe 6pence each. Call it 50 cents American. The whole program probably cost less than £1,000, including testing and installation." Nicholson was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the pilots who had died because they couldn't follow a diving enemy. Then he handed the restrictor back to Davies. "Install it," he said. "I want to test it myself." 3 days later, Nicholson got his chance. On October 21st, his squadron intercepted a formation of German bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt 109 fighters over Yorkshire. The engagement began at 18,000 feet, with the Spitfires diving through the fighter screen to attack the bombers. Nicholson locked onto a Messerschmitt that had separated from the main formation. The German pilot, seeing the Spitfire closing from his 6 o'clock position, did exactly what Nicholson expected. He pushed his stick forward and dove away in a steep -G descent. For months, this would have been the moment where Nicholson had to make an impossible choice: let the enemy escape, or follow and lose his engine. Now he simply pushed his stick forward and followed. The Merlin engine continued running. The propeller kept turning. The Spitfire stayed under power. The German pilot, hearing the Spitfire's engine still running behind him, realized his escape tactic had failed. He pulled up hard, trying to reverse the dive, but Nicholson was already there, closing the distance. The German aircraft took hits across the fuselage and wing, trailing smoke, and broke off the engagement, diving away again, this time in a genuine attempt to escape rather than a tactical feint. Nicholson let him go. The damaged aircraft was likely to crash anyway, and he needed to rejoin his squadron. But as he climbed back to altitude, he found himself thinking about the brass disc installed in his fuel line. A 50-cent piece of metal had just changed the fundamental tactics of aerial combat. The impact rippled across fighter command throughout November and December of 1940. German pilots, accustomed to the Spitfire's weakness, continued attempting their diving escape maneuver, only to find British fighters staying with them, engines running smoothly, closing the distance instead of gliding helplessly. Combat reports from this period show a dramatic shift in loss ratios. In September 1940, before the restrictor modification, Spitfires were being lost at a rate of 4.3 aircraft per week due to -G engine failures during combat. By December, after the modification was complete across fighter command, that number had dropped to 0.2 per week, and those few cases involved pilots who held -G for longer than 4 seconds, exceeding the restrictor's capability. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, the legendary pilot who had lost both legs in a pre-war flying accident and returned to combat with artificial limbs, wrote in his squadron log, "The modified Spitfires have fundamentally changed how we fight. The Jerries still try their old diving trick, but now we stay with them. They're learning slowly that the tactic doesn't work anymore. But learning costs them aircraft and pilots. Miss Schilling's little metal ring has defeated more German pilots than any gun upgrade ever could. But the story of the restrictor's impact goes beyond simple combat statistics. It affected pilot psychology in ways that were harder to quantify but equally important. Before the modification, every Spitfire pilot flew with the knowledge that a fundamental maneuver, diving to pursue an enemy, could endanger them. They second-guessed themselves in combat, hesitating at critical moments, calculating risks that their opponents didn't have to consider. After the modification, that psychological burden lifted. Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Wellham, who had lost his wingman to the -G problem in September, wrote to his mother in December, "We fly differently now, more aggressive, more confident. It's not just that the engine keeps running when we dive, it's that we don't have to think about it anymore. We can focus on flying and fighting instead of managing our aircraft's limitations." The difference in combat effectiveness is impossible to measure, but every pilot in the squadron can feel it. The restrictor remained in service throughout the war. As Rolls-Royce developed improved carburetors with better -G performance, the simple brass disc was eventually phased out, but not until mid-1943, nearly 3 years after its introduction. By that time, it had been installed in over 20,000 Spitfire and Hurricane fighters. Beatrice Schilling continued her work at Rolls-Royce throughout the war, eventually becoming one of the company's senior engineers. She never sought publicity for her invention, rarely spoke about it in interviews, and deflected credit whenever possible. In a rare public comment made in 1944, she said only, "I saw a problem that was ending pilots' lives. I found a solution that was simple enough to implement quickly. That's what engineers do." But the pilots who flew with her modifications saw it differently. After the war, veterans of fighter command established an informal tradition. At squadron reunions, when toasting the people and innovations that had won the conflict in the air, they would raise their glasses to Miss Schilling and her 50-cent miracle, a piece of stamped brass that had saved over 2,100 pilots by doing nothing more complicated than restricting fuel flow through a 9mm hole. The final irony of the story emerged decades later, when aviation historians analyzed German combat reports captured after the war. Throughout late 1940 and early 1941, German pilots filed increasingly frustrated accounts of their diving escape tactic failing against British fighters. German intelligence officers, trying to understand what had changed, theorized that the British had developed a new secret carburetor system requiring extensive engineering and manufacturing resources. They never imagined that the solution was a brass washer costing 50 cents, designed by one engineer working alone in a machine shop late at night, installed by mechanics in less than 30 minutes, and implemented across an entire air force in a matter of weeks. In the mathematics of warfare, where victory is often measured in production capacity, technological sophistication, and industrial might, sometimes the most decisive innovations are the simplest ones. A circular piece of metal, barely bigger than a coin, lighter than a pencil, costing less than a cup of tea, it changed the balance of power in the skies over Britain by solving a problem that everyone else thought required months of complex engineering. Douglas Bader kept one of the original restrictors after the war. It sat on his desk in a small wooden box, polished and preserved. When people asked about it, he would hold it up to the light, letting visitors see through the 9mm hole in the center and say, "Through this little opening I could see my enemies and they couldn't escape. Through this hole, thousands of us lived to come home." Never assume that big problems always require big solutions. James Nicholson, who would go on to become the only fighter command pilot awarded the Victoria Cross during the conflict, kept his restrictor as well. He had it mounted on a plaque with a small brass plate reading, "Miss Schilling's Orifice, the 50-cent device that saved my life 17 times. Beatrice Schilling, for her part, went on to have a distinguished engineering career, contributing to multiple aviation and automotive projects. She was awarded the Order of the British Empire in 1947 for her wartime service, though the citation carefully avoided mentioning the restrictor by its unofficial name. She passed away in 1990 at the age of 81. Having lived long enough to see her simple invention recognized as one of the most effective emergency modifications in aviation history. The restrictor itself, the actual physical component, can still be seen in several aviation museums across Britain. They sit in glass cases next to complex radar systems, advanced weapons, and sophisticated navigation equipment. Visitors often walk past them without a second glance, assuming they're looking at an ordinary washer or spacer, nothing worth noting. But the pilots who flew with them knew better. They knew that sometimes the difference between life and death, between victory and defeat, between coming home and never being seen again, could be measured in the diameter of a hole drilled through a piece of brass. 9mm, 50 cents, 2,100 lives saved. In the vast catalogue of wartime innovations, radar, jet engines, proximity fuses, code-breaking machines, Miss Schilling's Orifice stands apart not because of its complexity, but because of its elegant simplicity. One woman, one night, one machine shop, one insight. Keep fuel in the carburetor during negative G by restricting flow. Everything else followed from that single realization. The German Messerschmitt pilots eventually learned to stop using their diving escape tactic against Spitfires, but by then the damage was done. Months of combat had been fought under the assumption that British fighters had a fatal weakness. And when that weakness vanished overnight, the psychological impact was profound. German combat doctrine had to be rewritten. Tactics had to be reassessed. The comfortable certainty that a diving escape would work against a Spitfire was gone, and all of it. The tactical shift, the lives saved. The psychological advantage, the combat effectiveness, came from a piece of metal that would be worthless as scrap, invisible to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, simple enough to be manufactured by the thousands in an ordinary metal stamping plant. This is what makes the story of Miss Schilling's Orifice remarkable. Not the technology itself, which was almost absurdly simple, but the fact that in the midst of total war, when nations were mobilizing every resource, and pouring unlimited funding into weapons development, the solution to a critical problem came from an individual engineer working with basic tools and common materials, implementing an idea that required no new factories, no exotic materials, no complex supply chains, no extended testing programs, just brass, a lathe, and insight. The restrictors were eventually replaced by improved carburetor designs as originally planned, but they served for 3 critical years through some of the most intense aerial combat in history. They were installed in Spitfires that fought over Britain, Malta, North Africa, and eventually Western Europe. They flew with pilots from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and a dozen other nations. They operated in freezing cold and desert heat, in aircraft that accumulated hundreds of flight hours, through combat damage and rough field conditions. And they almost never failed. The design was so simple, so robust, that there was virtually nothing to go wrong. No moving parts, no electronics, no complex mechanisms, just a hole drilled to a precise diameter in a piece of corrosion-resistant metal. Beatrice Schilling's personnel file at Rolls-Royce, preserved in company archives, contains a handwritten note from her supervisor dated December 1940. Miss Schilling's carburetor modification has been validated in combat operations. Initial skepticism about power loss has proven unfounded. Pilots report no operational disadvantages. Estimated lives saved to date, approximately 200. Recommend commendation for exceptional contribution to war effort. 200 lives in the first 2 months. The number would grow to over 2,000 by war's end. There is a final detail worth noting. When the German aviation industry eventually learned about the restrictor modification, through intelligence reports and examination of captured aircraft, their engineering staff was reportedly incredulous. Surely the British had developed something more sophisticated than a simple brass disc. There must be more to the modification than appeared obvious. They spent weeks analyzing captured examples, searching for hidden features or complex metallurgy. They found nothing but brass and a 9mm hole. The German engineers had been expecting British ingenuity to manifest as complexity matching their own fuel injection systems. Instead, they discovered that British ingenuity had manifested as simplicity, solving a complex problem with a solution so basic that it seemed impossible it could work as well as it did. And that, perhaps, is the deepest lesson of Miss Schilling's orifice. In a conflict defined by industrial mobilization, technological arms races, and scientific competition, sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones that don't require any of those things. Sometimes the answer is just a person, a problem, and a willingness to think past the assumption that solutions must be proportional in complexity to the problems they solve. 50 cents, 9mm, 2,100 lives. One engineer working late into the night, creating something that would change the course of aerial warfare without fanfare, without complexity, without anything more than insight and brass. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.